In the November of 1989, the world watched with hope as the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, and the citizens of East and West Berlin were able to unite as one, as Berliners. This event would go down in history as the beginning of the end of the United States and Soviet Union's Cold War, a multifaceted conflict that had loomed over the world since the end of the Second World War, and spanned over 50 years. The Soviet Union would eventually go on to collapse in 1991, which would result in a whirlpool of cultural mixing, as the Soviet Union had not allowed much art and culture from the West into their borders.
But before the fall of the Soviet Union, and even before the fall of the Berlin Wall, a different kind of wall would be taken down between the two rival nations that would signify a readiness to merge culturally. The relaying of information has been a crucial aspect of any society, and as technological advancements continued, so did the way information was relayed from an authority to the citizens of a society. It's easy to summarize the progression of communication. Societies went from public announcements in a literal sense, coming from the mouth of an authority being yelled directly to the gathered masses, to the printing press, being able to publish pamphlets and posters for the masses to see and read. Then transitioning to radio, which presented the authority the ability to speak directly to citizens anywhere as long as they were in proximity to a radio device. Television then came along, adding the effect of images to the spoken word. The adoptions of these technologies follows the assumption that the society has the capabilities or desire to produce these forms of information relaying devices. During the late stages of the Cold War in the United States, the idea of receiving critical information from a medium other than radio or television was one that seemed absurd or inefficient. Sure, posters were a great way to advertise a movie or possibly a concert, or maybe they would be used for a niche government program, such as the War on Drugs campaign, which used posters directed towards the younger generations of Americans. These cases aside, the use of posters in the United States was not a crucial form of communication between the government and its citizens. Instead, that duty was handed over to more modern and efficient forms of technology, like radio and television broadcasts. But this was not the case in the Soviet Union. Though having the industrial capacity to produce ample televisions and radio sets, and even many citizens of the Soviet Union possessing them, this was not their primary means of communication from the authority to their citizens. Instead, the Soviet Union opted for a different medium, the poster. Since the birth of the Soviet Union, posters had been a powerful form of communication. When one thinks of Soviet Russia, it would be unsurprising if images of classic Lenin-era or World War II-era propaganda posters came to mind. The political propaganda poster played a critical role in the formation of the Soviet Union and can be seen dating back to the very beginning of the nation. Following the Russian Revolution of 1917, this new regime was tasked with creating a new social order composed of alien ideas and conveying them to a largely illiterate, post-feudal population. The answer the new leadership went with was, of course, posters. Posters were spread all across the nation in a multitude of ways, coming by train, boat, or even pulled by cart. Many posters were placed in the center of towns for the population to see, and the removal of these posters by anyone other than state officials was a crime labeled a, quote, counter-revolutionary act. The posters of the 1920s had a focus on the party and the heroic figures that represented the masses, many depicting the face of the new regime, Lenin himself as well. In the 1930s, the topic of these posters shifted along with the new priorities of the party. The heroic figures were replaced with a collective call to work towards the regime's new goal of rapid industrialization. And eventually in the late 30s and the early 40s, the focus of the posters shifted yet again to focus onto the ongoing Second World War. The visually striking styles of these posters became famous worldwide and were responsible for several new forms of design, including Russian avant-garde, constructivism, and most famously, socialist realism. The term socialist realism was officially declared the standard of Soviet art by Maxim Gorky in 1932. This style was a state-mandated, idealistic depiction of life in the Soviet Union, and on a greater level would be followed by similar regimes, as can be seen in Chinese and North Korean propaganda posters. The The style of these posters are still referenced in contemporary pop culture, with artists such as Shepard Fairey modeling much of his famous brand Obey's art style in the constructivist and socialist realism fashion.
With a societal shift successfully completed and the enemies of World War II vanquished, the problems of the Soviet Union started to shift. For the 3 decades following World War II, Soviet posters became useful mediums of anti-Western propaganda during the height of the Cold War. But as the 1980s set in, the problems of the Soviet Union turned into the problems we would find in any modern society. Social issues such as health, public services, housing, family, education, and ecology became the focus of much of these posters. And with the new subject matter came a new style as well. Starting in 1953 with Stalin's death, the classic forms of Soviet design would enter a great change, following Khrushchev's new de-Stalinization movement. Though socialist realism remained a crucial point of design for the following decades, it wouldn't be until the 1980s that we would see a massive stylistic shift, when Gorbachev heavily relaxed the restrictions on design within the Soviet Union following his Glasnost and Perestroika movement, which largely focused on the enlargement of social and individual freedoms within the nation. A defining characteristic of many Soviet posters, outside of their definitive styles up until this point, was their color palette, which was heavily centered around the use of reds. The new Soviet posters of the 1980s demonstrated a clear shift away from this strict color palette, which represented a newfound freedom in their designs. But the freedom to explore did not come easily. The state-enforced cultural divide between the East and West, known as the Iron Curtain, presented a unique problem for artists in the Soviet Union. That problem being a lack of knowledge of contemporary styles, which limited their reference points to other more modern forms of design. Due to the limitations imposed by the Iron Curtain, an artistic underground sprouted in the Soviet Union. Though cut off from the West, they were not entirely isolated. There were official avenues of cultural exchange between the United States and the Soviets, notably the Lacey-Zarubin Agreement of 1958, which was a bilateral agreement between the two states to exchange cultural arts such as film and dance. But these forms of art were not of much use for the typographers and graphic designers of the Soviet posters. They instead had to opt for a much more inconsistent way of cultural exchange. The act of smuggling in goods from the West into the Soviet Union was incredibly risky. Those caught smuggling and those caught with smuggled goods were liable for severe punishments, including several months in a labor camp, otherwise known as the Gulag. But these risks were not enough to stop many of the artists of the Soviet Union from obtaining Western design materials. To the Soviet designers working in state-run firms, these graphics, prints, and fonts found in Western design magazines were more valuable than any other product the West could produce. Designers such as Herb Lubalin, Ivan Chermayev, Tom Geismar, and Lut Dorfman were viewed as underground heroes in the Soviet Union for their innovative graphic design styles. What resulted was a new style of Soviet posters that, coupled with the new subject matters, had become almost unrecognizable compared to the infamous propaganda of the past, and in many cases, their only similarity being the Russian language itself. It wouldn't be until a wall fell that this newfound style of Soviet propaganda poster would become known in the West. In the October of 1989, the Soviet Union presented the United States with an unexpected opportunity, tearing down a wall between the daily lives of the citizens of the US and the Soviet Union in the form of 75 loaned Soviet posters, all of which had been produced in the past 3 years. The American Institute of Graphic Design's San Diego chapter quickly jumped to seize this unique opportunity, and the exhibit was held at the Hoya Museum of Contemporary Art. The exhibit was an immediate success. The citizens of the United States were enthralled by what they saw behind the curtain that divided the two countries, and within days, 15 stops around the nation were added to the exhibition. It would only be a month later the world would witness another wall fall in Berlin that would officially mark the beginning of the end of the decades-long Cold War, and 3 years later, the collapse of an empire. But with its collapse, the Soviet Union has left a litany of art unlike anything the West had seen before. From unique music and films to design styles, the arts of the Soviet Union can be seen as a representation of a greater principle: that even under the most oppressive forces, unique art will always be a critical aspect of any society.